So I'm Phil Cantor. I live 12 Baptist Hill Road, corner of Baptist Hill and River Street. Across the street from me, my neighbor and friend is Danielson. And he moved in, when he moved in a few years back, he set up what you see now, plastic roof structure. I thought it was a greenhouse until I hear him bending wood and making boats.
I hope you didn't hear that.
You could hear the saw. You could hear the saw. You could hear the machine. And you know, I think it's amazing boat building in Conway, and knowing and then getting to learn from him, just listening to him, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do about how this is done. Is just fascinating. And I'm just gonna. So he wrote a book. It's called Introduction to Wooden Boat Building. Always more to learn. He published it. He's asking $20 for it. I read it. I liked it.
So learn anything?
Well, yeah, actually, I did.
It's okay. It's okay.
I have
I
a
see.
Marblehead Yacht Club shirt. So I found
It's
this
the Marblehead Bellboy.
That's me. That's me. So without further ado, Danielson, thank you.
So I hope you can hear me, I guess. And it's nice to be living in Conway.
But there's no ocean here.
But it's downhill.
True.
That's what I say to that question. But yeah, it's too far away, but I can't help it. I don't know if you can see this well enough, but. But ooh.
Can you see?
Yeah, there's no choice, I guess. I just pulled this picture off of an email the other day because it shows a bunch of different bow shapes. That's one of the fascinating things about wooden boats. So, you know, and when I was growing up in Africa, and when I started sailing in Rhode Island, most of the boats were wooden boats. And it was the beauty of them, and the beauty of the way they moved in the water, and the way people of skill handled them, that was fascinating. So that's why I have that picture there. Let's see what's going to happen here. There we go. So we were living in North Leverett in the 70s. Actually, we lived for a while. We lived in a plank house built maybe in the middle 1700s. 2-inch chestnut planks, vertical, mortise and tenon into pine beams. And with 1-inch pine beaded, nailed horizontally on the inside of those planks. It was a beautiful structure of wood. You know, but you know, I had a chance to sail once in a while because Dottie was a Marbleheader. Her mother was living in Marblehead, and we went back and forth and saw boats. And I think in 1978, one of the first wooden boat magazine was published. And a couple of our friends, one being Jerry Axelson, bought the plans for a boat, they both having been sailors. And when I saw those plans with the design, with the lines and the construction, I said to myself, that's what I want to do. And I started reading as well as looking, but reading everything I could about building boats and sailing boats, and that kind of started it. In 1986, I think it was. It was probably actually 1983, I have to say. 1983, one day we were driving out of Marblehead on our usual path, and we saw this boat not looking like this. It had the stem head had been cut off, like here, cutting right into the planks. He had cut the top of the stem off, the front timber of the boat. And it was sitting there in this driveway, just blocked up, with the front end and a bunch of tarps laid over it. And we drove back, back and forth. Every once in a while we'd be in Marblehead and we'd drive that way. And it sat there for 3 years. And the tarps disintegrated. And the leaves fell in, and to join the paper towels and beer cans and stuff that had been left in the bilge. And then one day he nailed the for sale sign to the hull. And so we went and bought it. And then I needed to know what to do with it. So, this is going crazy here, but let's go back here. See if I can go back. Okay, I'll stop it here. I went to talk to this man. This is Link Hawks. There was just above the water at the end of Marblehead. There's a pond called Red's Pond. And I think with Link Hawks' father was a boat painter in the boatyards. And I think that with when he died, his wife, who was a peach by name and otherwise, his wife bought this old property next to the pond where there had been a big dairy barn that had burned down years before. And so I went to see Link, because she bought it to save some of old Marblehead, because she could see it becoming more and more of a Boston suburb. And she also needed it as a place for Link to hang out, because he was, I call him a very skillful drunk. But he could do anything. And he kept animals. He kept this, what do they call a bull? He took it to Saks Antiques because he wanted to take his bull into the china shop. But Saks wasn't having any of it, so they went to the bar instead. But Link kept saying, and I was going to, there were boats. People had their boats back there on that lot, and I'd saying, could I move this boat up here so I could work on it? And he'd say, well, you might be able to. And that's the way that went. So, but he told me some stories. Like he said, there was a couple of guys who started a boatyard down in what the area called the shipyard. And they had this big schooner that they were working on the deck of it, and they were replacing the planks on the top of the edge of the deck. covering boards, and these two guys had worked tediously, taking off this one covering board as carefully as they could so they could reuse it or use it as a pattern for the one they were going to make. And so this young man shows up in the office, and he says, "Could I, do you have any work?" And they said, "Well, do you know anything about this?" Well, he said, "I come down from Nova Scotia, and I've worked on some boats with my father, and And they said, "Well, we have this job here. We're replacing the covering boards on this schooner out here. You think you could do that?" And he said, "Sure, I'll work at that." So he gets out there with his crowbar and his sledgehammer, and he just tears that thing apart. And he has that all cleared off in an hour or two or something. Where these guys have been working for days, slaving away, trying to do it so carefully. They're just up in the office saying, "Oh, this guy's getting himself into a lot of trouble. This is not going to go good." But he gets it all cleared off. Then he gets out some pattern stock and starts making patterns for making a new covering board. He files it all in, gets its lines, gets the shapes, gets the joints laid out, and puts it all together, as fast as these guys had been taking the old one off. That was one story Link told me. But besides, so then we went to said, "Well, this isn't going to work. I can't." So then I went to the boatyard, and the boatyard owner, Ralph Anderson, we found him sitting on a forklift down in one of his boatyards, and we told him this story and that we had this boat, and he said, "Is that the boat that's there on Beacon Street?" And we said, "Yes," and he said, "Yeah, I looked at that." He said, "Well, if you, we'll move it into the yard, and if you strip the paint off, then we'll do the whole work for a number that sounded pretty good to me, because I knew what it would take, and you can finish the job." So then we go back to that first picture, and if I can figure out how to do this. This is back at the old mill shop at the Lower Graves Yard in Marblehead, and I think this was the last boat that actually came out of that shop. Maybe not the last one that came out, because there was a boat that was never worked on in there, because then they turned that area, that building, into a paint room. But after that, they took the old floor out and stuff. But this was how that came out, and we bought it because it looked beautiful. The lines are just gorgeous. And the man that had it said he thought it was built by the Rice brothers. He thought it was a Dark Harbor. I talked to the Rice brother, Robert Rice, and he said, "Oh, no, we weren't building anything like that in 1929, which is what he had said as a number." And so then I talked to more people describing the boat, and finally I talked to Maynard Bray, who was one of the people who started Wooden Boat Magazine, and he said, I described it a little bit. He said, "Where are you?" I said, in Marblehead. He said, is that the boat that was on Beacon Street right around the corner from Cradle Skid Lane? He said he had been down there with his son hauling a triangle sloop out of Graves, and he saw it, and if he hadn't had that boat in tow already, he would have got that one. He said that's number 5 of the Winter Harbor 21s, built in 1906 in Marblehead by Graves and Packard. I mean, Burgess and Packard in Marblehead. And they're working to get them all back to Winter Harbor. And when we were working on finishing the everything, we went up to Winter Harbor and we saw these boats and the boats they had there. And somebody who just moved into Winter Harbor came down and bought this, so we didn't lose a lot of money, or any really, on that job. So then we go on. So that was maybe a Burgess boat. It was definitely built by Burgess and Packard, but it was probably designed by Packard. But then we knew this man who knew that we had done this job, and he really was fascinated by Burgess, Starling Burgess, and I've seen this boat sitting in Gloucester full of water, and I think this is partially done already, but we told him about this boat, and it needed to be rebuilt, but and have work done on it. And this is an Atlantic class sloop that Burgess designed in 1928. Built one boat. Got 88 orders. This is 1928, just before 1929. Got 88 orders. Ordered 99 boats from Abking and Rasmussen in Germany. And over the course of a number of years, they built 99 boats to this plan that were all shipped over to the States for. But this one, I mean, its history was weird. We don't know much about it, but I did this outside there at the Reds Pond Yard, because while working on the Winter Harbor, the other boat, I got to know Bill Hawks, who was Link's brother. And Bill was a cannon maker. He had a big 8-foot bed lathe down in his cellar and made cannons, signal cannons. But he was the older brother of the Hawks family, and he really controlled that property. And in the meantime, by the time I was working on this boat, Link had died, and so this is the way that boat turned out. It was on its way to Florida when this picture was taken. The Atlantic class sloop. They're still sailed. They're still an active class, but in after World War II, those boats always had a problem. They were tight planked in the German European fashion with mahogany, African mahogany, and they were tight planks. There's no caulking. They're made so the planks fit tight to each other, inside and outside. sometimes with some little groove or something on the middle. But when the planks swell, when they go into the water, there's a lot of pressure because with cedar planking, the wood is kind of soft and will compress. With a hardwood planking, it doesn't compress, but it does swell. We were talking earlier, she was asking about, I don't know, we're talking about waterproofing. It's like you can't do it. I think if you have, I've read, whether it's right or not exactly, that if you have 6 layers of epoxy glass layup, it'll stop 99% of the water. But when a boat is in the water is under pressure, and osmosis works. Semi-permeable membranes, no matter how tight, the water has a way of going through because it's a very small molecule. Anyway, how do we go back to Link here? Anyway, see where we are. After I built that boat, I built some little boats, but I should go back here, sorry. Sometime in the 60s, by there was that property by the pond, that Link, that the Hawk's mother had bought, and that Link was working on. And across the pond was this barn. There was an old livery barn behind that house. And the houses on that street on the other side of the pond were so close together, you couldn't move that barn out to the street. There's a famous Marblehead house mover who could move anything. He moved an insurance building in New Jersey, like a mile down the road or something, but the contract said they had to be able to work in the building every day, so they were moving all the utilities with the building. And it was a brick building. He did it successfully, famous, fabulous house mover. He got the barn up on. The Hawkses said, "We'll take it." So the house mover got the barn up on timbers, and Link wanted to move it across the pond on the ice, but the ice wasn't strong enough. So then he had to back off, and there was a man living in the house in front, Mr. Leahy, who was an engineer, and he calculated the weight of the barn. And Link got 150 steel drums and made a raft and moved the barn onto the raft. And he had the trucks over there on the other side, which you can't really see there. The Hawks brothers had built a foundation for it. Gerald Smith, who lived across the street there, was an old sailor captain, and who will come up later. He came over one day when the barn was up on the raft. He said to Link, "There's no wind.
Oh, no.
Let's row it across." And they got a kid to hand the line. They put the dory in the water. They had this kid holding the line tied to the raft, and they rowed it across the pond. And then the house movers got it up onto the foundation. So that Yes.
How do you get this building onto the raft? I didn't get that.
I don't know how they did it. But the house mover could move anything. He was very accomplished at this. There were lots of houses all over that town facing the wrong way. Stuck in, next. So this, after, this is where the barn ended up. And after I had done a few jobs, when I did that Atlantic class sloop job, there was a fisherman, a famous fisherman, Bob Brown, who he owned the boats that went down or didn't go down in the perfect storm, the big fishing boats. He was using the barn because he had family relations with the Hawkses, like everybody in town almost. He was using it as storage for fishing gear, the barn, and Bill got him to move out so that I could move into the barn. And it was, I don't know when that was, 1991 or something like that. And by that time, we were living in Marblehead because Dottie's mother got to be 90 years old, and she needed somebody to work with her, and so that's where we were. So I had this shop. I had contacts and a little bit of business and a place to work. And that's where I was the rest of that time.
Well, it didn't look like that boat would fit in the barn.
Oh, it doesn't. Nothing. Only little boats fit in that barn. No. The door. Well, I don't know. I can't. I built one. I built an 18-foot boat with a 6-foot beam, and the loft, which we got out of that door, tipped up on its side at an angle, the upper door. I built a few smaller boats, a number of smaller boats, in the barn that came out the big door down below. But no, they won't go in there. It was a livery stable. There were still 3 stalls in the back. But it was a beautiful, beautiful shop. 22 by 32, something like that. Let's see where we go from here. That's the pond with ice on it so that the geese are walking. When we were living in that old house in North Leverett, it got sold when we had to sell that house. It got sold to a couple, and the man when they I don't know how it all happened, but he said, well, my mother was a Marbleheader, and she was a smith. And I just mentioned Gerald Smith. She was Gerald Smith's sister. Their father was Charlton Smith, who was a boat builder in Marblehead. They're very, very accomplished boat builder. He'd been a seaman in sail, and had worked for some time at a Whitehall builder, the Whitehall builder in Boston. Might have been Charleston or some other town, but basically Boston, Whitehall builder, and Gerald lived across the street from the pond, and he became my first, what I called, chief consultant. When I had questions about what to do, because I had worked with with the carpenters down at the Graves Yard, or the carpenter really, because there wasn't much more woodwork being done. There's still one carpenter working for that yard. But a lot of my experience was from books or from seeing how boats were built. The boats that I had worked at restoring, or could see how they were done. And you learn a lot doing that. But there are always questions. There's always more to learn, like my book says. And Gerald knew a lot, because he grew up in his father's kitchen, in his parents' kitchen, listening to stories, listening to people talk, seeing his father work. He said when he was 14, his father sent him to Bill Chamberlain, who was a famous Marblehead boat builder who lived near to where we lived, and or had lived there. And when Gerald was 14, I don't know when that was, it probably was like the early 1920s. He said Chamberlain was hopping mad because he had just bought a load of cedar plank stock and had to pay 4 cents a foot for this stock that was probably like 2 feet wide and 30 feet long. But so times change. You know, my time in North Leverett, you know, besides being introduced to the structure of wooden boats and having friends that we still have, I also got to know wood and sawmills and sawyers. I worked with Wilton Stone some in Montague, Sawyer, Fred Hayes in Orange, Whitney, whatever his other name was, I don't know, in Montague, just working in the sawmills and seeing the wood and knowing these people. And that was, in a lot of ways, the basis for what I call my business. Just being able to find the wood and liking to go and talk to the sawyers, and being interested in where it comes from and where they are and how it's done and what you can get. And that's a big part of that whole business. But so Gerald was a duck hunter, and Bill Chamberlain had built and sold something he called a gunning dory that was 19 foot long. And Gerald had taken, I don't know how he got them. He had Chamberlain's molds for the shapes of the timbers. On this boat, this is a boat that Gerald built. A 17-foot boat based on Bill Chamberlain's 19-foot gunning dory. This is the 17-foot gunning dory, and the frames and the stem shapes, Gerald had the molds that Chamberlain had used, which he gave to me, which I left behind in my shop because it's useful there. But it was fabulous. It was wonderful. I built one of these boats, but this is the one that Gerald had built. And the man here is Walter Wales, who was a naval architect, a young naval architect working for Ted Hood, who documented the boat that Gerald built as he built it, watched it being built. So I had the plans that Walter had built, had drawn, and the molds that Gerald had used built when I built one of these boats. But Walter said that there was one time Gerald said to him, he used to go gunning with Gerald. Gerald said, "When you're 40, you'll stop shooting ducks." And, that went, okay. When he was 40 years old, he was living in Maine, and he saw this pair of ducks come down. And they were sitting there on the water, and he shot them. And he said, "Oh my, what have I done?" They were just billing and cooing, and now they're dead. And he hasn't shot ducks ever since. Gerald, I'd go whenever I'd go to see him. I would, if I had a question, a lot of times I would, when I was walking past his shop. He was being a decoy carver, and he had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he was in remission, but he had his little shop where he did his carving, and he'd say, "Come on in," and so I'd go in and we'd talk. He said he never knew a Democrat, which was patently false. Because we know of Democrats that he knew that he didn't know. But one day he had a picture of himself standing with old George Bush. He had a sail, old canvas sails hung up behind in the middle of this shop area, so his coal stove could keep it warm in the wintertime. And he had this photograph tacked to the wall. And I think he saw my eyes catch it one day, just stop at it. And he said, we'd never talk politics. He would never know what you were. But he said, we don't agree about everything, but I like talking to you, Thad. It was one of the nicest things anybody ever said to me. But he knew so much. He had been captain for George Peabody Gardner, who was like the chairman of the board of AT&T and part of the Gardner family that owned Roke Island, that's down east in Maine, and he had been captain for him and sailed up and down the coast, and was a great person to know and to have as a resource. When his cancer came back, he wasn't in his shop one day, and I went to the house, and he was there in the kitchen saying, "Come on in, come on in." So And then I went there every day after that for the next. He said, well, they gave me 2 weeks to live, but I think it was 3 months before he finally died. But it was always fun. I was talking to him, or I was in there one day, and I met Lee Van Gemmert, who was an old sailor, one of the best sailors ever. And another man were in there, where the three of us were there with Gerald, and Gerald at this point was on the hospital bed in the dining room, and we were talking, and Gerald fell asleep. And while he was asleep, we were just talking, and somehow it came out with some question, it's like, what's it with the Coast Guard? You got these kids from all over the country who never seen a boat, and they got in the Coast Guard, and now they're telling everybody how to run their boats or what you ought to do. And Gerald woke up, started to talk, and he says, and I don't remember the name, but he said, this captain, this old Marblehead sea captain, when he was a boy, or young, he joined the Navy, and he went to Portsmouth for induction, and the class that he was in, the group that he was in, was taken out in a ship, and they were each given a turn at the wheel to steer. And so when it came his turn, he had this young man had been on fishing trips to the Banks as a boy. So he knew that he wanted to steer a straight course, and he worked to do it. And the officer at the helm there said, "You've done this before." And so then later on in his service, this is the way Gerald told this story, just about like this. Later on in his service, he was at Vicksburg, and they were taking on prisoners. And he had this thought. He said, the ship's company isn't really that big, and we're not really trained for this. And we're taking on a lot of prisoners, and this is worrisome. And he had been kind of friendly with the ship's doctor, so he told the ship's doctor this. And later on, somebody came to him and said, "You're wanted in the captain's quarters." And he's saying, "What have I done now?" But he goes to the captain's cabin, and he finds the captain sitting there with the doctor. And the captain says, "Take a seat. Sit down." And the doctor says, "Tell him what you told me." And he did. And the captain said, "I hadn't thought of that." And then he said to the steward, he said, "Bring us 3 beer bottles. 3 bottles of beer." And the steward brings the bottles of beer, and so they sat there and drank their beer, and then they went back to their duties. But when he said Vicksburg, all of a sudden you knew it was the Civil War. And this is like possibly the oldest direct first-hand story Gerald knew. One day we went to stop, and his son Lyman met us out in the street and said, Gerald isn't in any shape to be visited today. But last night he was talking in his sleep all night long, going through the pilotage into harbors, the recipe for fish chowder, going through all these things, and he just had so much he could tell. But that was, it was just fun. When he was telling that story, I met Lee Van Gemmert. When Gerald died, Lee became my chief consultant. This is the gunning dory that I built. These are other boats I've built based on these old plans, but I'll stop here.
Pat, can I ask a question?
Sure.
You talk about having that pattern or whatever somebody left you. What was that made out of? Is it a flexible
Pine.
material?
It was pine.
Okay, so did it have any bend? No bend to it?
It had shape. It was just a pattern, just a thin piece that showed the line of the stem and also the frames.
Okay.
Dories are built really, or always were, built on sawn frames or many of them, sawn frames with bent frames in between. And these double enders, this one as well as the gunning dory, you have stems at both ends. You have a bow stem and a stern stem. And he had these patterns for those pieces. When you make a boat like this one, I lofted it, which means making a full-size drawing so that you can make patterns. This was, I don't know, I don't think it was actually in that, but this was a no man's land boat designed by the one of the Beatles in New Bedford. The no man's land, the Beatles, their main, well, maybe I shouldn't say that, but one of their big productions had always been whale boats, whatever they are, like 30-foot long rowing sailing boats that actually chase the whales off the ships. But the no man's land is an island right off of Martha's Vineyard, offside of Martha's Vineyard, that was used as a summer fishing camp. And they had these boats that were 17 to 20 foot long, shallops, basically old style, lapstrake, lightweight boats that were the fishing boats off of maybe all around the coast, but in particular no man's land, where they were dragged up onto the beach at night, and then slid back into the water to go fishing. And they had relatively small sailing rigs, because they would sail out and then in a way, or row out, so that then they could get blown back in the stiff afternoon breeze that was typical down there. And this just shows really how I built that boat. But when I was building this boat, this was my first time when I consulted Lee Van Gemmert, where I said, we weren't. This boat wasn't going to be dragged up and down the beach. Although the guy I was building it for did talk like he might, but in the plan it talks about having a steel or an iron shoe on the bottom of the keel, so that you could drag it across things without damaging the wood. And I looked. I didn't think I really needed it, but I looked anyway, and there was, I don't know if you could buy a 2-inch, 20-foot long piece or 15-foot long piece of bronze stock. You probably could. Pretty expensive. You couldn't find iron or steel, but you could find stainless steel. I said to Lee, what do you think of stainless steel? He said, come over to my shop. Where he had the bandsaw that he had made, and he went to one of his little drawers in his back room, and he pulls out a little piece of stainless steel. And you look at one side of it, and it looks shiny and beautiful, and you look at the other side of it, and it's like eaten away. And he says when he was working in the pattern shop at the Four River Shipyard, they were he was like the, I don't know what you call him. I'd call him the mechanic, but he's the one who made things. But he was working with engineers, and they were investigating different materials, and they took this piece of stainless steel, and they fastened it to something, and then they ran salt water past it. And they discovered, if it hadn't been discovered before, what's called crevice corrosion, where if stainless steel is oxygenated, if it has oxygen passing on it, it gets protected from corrosion. But if it's tight against something and there's water moving so that it's electronically connected to it, it just wastes away. And it wasn't just a story. He had this actual thing illustrating this feature of this material. It's the kind of guy he was. It was when I think he was the when I built this boat here with another friend of mine who had like many Marblehead kids worked for Hood in the sail loft when he was in high school. And he said when he was working for Hood, he thought he knew of Lee as the man that was sent to teach the Arab sheiks how to sail the boats that Ted Hood had designed that the Arab sheiks were buying. When he was his grandfather was a boat builder at Lawley's, which was a great boat building operation in South Boston and Dorchester. And he had been Lee built a snipe in his grandfather's garage when he was 15 and became well known as a sailor, sailing that boat. And later on he he was the world champion in the Indian class, which was the biggest racing class in Massachusetts Bay. That may come up later, but he was sailing the Indians, and in the 50s he got the Indian class to buy hood sails, and they were having the end of the season dinner, and Ted Hood came up to him and said, if you ever need a job, come to me. And not long after that, the Four River Shipyard was shutting down, and so he went and started working for Ted Hood. And he was like Ted Hood's tactician in the Southern Ocean Racing Conference, racing that really made Ted Hood's business go because of his success. And he was alternate skipper in those campaigns, and he told me this story. He said he was with Hood on Nefertiti, a boat that Hood had designed to be an America's Cup contender in Newport Harbor. And they were on this boat, and they saw the Stevens brothers coming across the harbor in a whaler, and Olin and Rod Stevens, and they came up to Nefertiti, and Ted said, come aboard, and so they came aboard, and after a few minutes, Olin, who was always the speaker of those two, Olin said, you're building sails for us, and you're building sails for your own boat. I trust you completely, but this could raise questions. What do you have to say? And Ted stood there for a minute, and then he turned to Lee, and he said, this is Lee Van Gemmert. I trust him with my life. I will give him to you for this competition. He will set up a sail loft in Newport. He will make all your sails. And that's the way it went. And the Stevens boat won. And Lee was just, I sailed with him in his boat. We were walking the dog through the lane by Lee's house, and I said, let's go in. And so we went in, and they sat us down, and Lee was sitting there at the table with his wife, and they got tea, and her dog hopped up on the chair, and his wife said, "Oh, that's fine." And then they told us that just a couple of days before, his wife had a pain in her knee or something, and they'd gone to the doctor, and she had stage 4 cancer of, I don't know exactly what, but she had 2 days to live, and she died in 2 days. But before that, he had been to a cocktail party. He was part of the Board of Trustees of Mass Maritime Academy, where he had graduated, and he'd been talking to some guy who been talking about Indians, this class of boats. It's very like this boat. And the man said, "Oh, I have an Indian in my backyard. You could get it." And so he did. He had a trailer that he had built for his old Indian, and he went down and got this boat, and we rebuilt it together and got sailing it, and it was a great boat to sail, and it was a lot of fun. But this no man's land boat, we can go down to the next one. That's it timbered out. With the lap strake, you get structure. In that previous picture, there's no framework at all. It's just the planks, the plank shapes, and the joining of the planks, which was all copper riveted, that held that shape together. When you build structure into it that doesn't have rails at the rail or anything like that yet, but the seats and the ribs and the riser for the seats, all those things sort of solidify the shape, but the shape is really in the shape of the planks and the fastening of the planks.
What kind of wood was that interior?
Cedar. Cedar. I think the seats were Spanish cedar, which is more like a mahogany.
What is the beam on that boat?
Well, it's 18 feet. I think it's about 6 feet. I may have the plan here. This is a Danish seine boat. If we went way back, which we won't, and it doesn't hardly matter, but I'd been interested in the boats of Ralph Monroe that he called round bottom Sharpies. Sharpies are strictly flat bottom boats, but he was sailing out of Florida and wanted, this was way back, but he wanted a boat that wasn't flat bottom but would sail like a Sharpie. And there's a lot of very fascinating ideas in that, and I had built a 13-foot boat, catch rigged, 13-foot catch, open boat. That was really a neat little boat. But I had it at the wooden boat show in Mystic, and this couple came along and with their stepdaughter or their daughter and son-in-law or something, I think, something like that. And so there were 4 of them, and they said, could we go for a ride? And I always liked to sail around when I was doing the shows, because otherwise you're just standing there on the dock talking to people and they don't know nothing about what's going on. And so I took them out, and in the middle, we were out there sailing around in the cove at Mystic, and the squall comes up. And we sailed through it. You know, I don't know what the people on the shore were thinking, looking at this. Or, I don't really know what those people thought, and I didn't remember any of it. I mean, I remember the event, but the people, I don't know, they just came and they went. I was to find out sort of years later that when they came ashore, the man says, I'm going to have him build me a boat. I didn't know this. But like a year or 2 later, this man shows up at one of the boat shows I was doing, and he says, well, I'd like to have this boat built out of this Danish book of Danish wooden boat designs, but I don't have the motor yet. I don't have the engine. So And I don't have the money. The stock market isn't doing well enough or something. But I'm working on it. So, you know, and it's happened a couple of years. He'd come back and he'd say the same thing. You know, and then one day he came and he said, I got the engine, but I want a different boat. And what he wanted was this boat. It was a Danish seine boat with this big engine in the middle. What he had was he was into single cylinder gas engines, make and break engines mostly. And he had a 5-horse make and break Atlantic engine made in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, new old stock. Never been run. And I got these plans from the Danish Maritime Museum. And we built the boat. You know, this is lap straight construction, much heavier with sawn frames laid in. These are floors laid in. This is that boat framed up. He wanted what he called a hunter cabin. This is the 5-horse Atlantic. This is the boat finished. I had taken it to the main boat builders show in Portland.
What's the length of that?
20 feet. And that's the boat underway. I mean, the North Sea exhaust, the exhaust pipe's going out both sides and it's blowing smoke. He had I don't know how many. He made 5 or 6 various size single cylinder engines. Said when his mother was a professor at Yale, and there was somebody in the New Haven area who had a cider mill where he ran his press or something with this single cylinder engine. That, you know, and he'd ride his bike out to this place and be looking in the cobwebby windows in the cider mill, and the man would come out and say, "You want to see the engine run, don't you?" and so he'd do it. And years later, the old cider man's son put the engine up for sale, and he had bought it. I think that started his collection. He had a big, I don't know what it was, like a 25-horse engine with 2 flywheels that were like 5 feet diameter in his cellar, tied to a generator for when they lost power. And he had a pipe going out through the cellar wall that was tied to a well pipe. I think it was like a 10-inch well pipe coming up out of the driveway, like. And when they ran that engine, it blew smoke rings out over the lake. They lived up by Sebago Lake. He had a bunch of these engines. Anyway, that's it running up there. This man was a fisherman in Marblehead. He had at least part of his family. I don't really know how it all was. He was connected to the Peaches and the Adamses. His mother might have been an Adams. His name was Burns. He grew up down by New Bedford, or no, Fall River, sailing with his father. Then he went off to war, went to New Guinea, was running a launch or something off the shore of New Guinea early on in the Americans' part of World War II. And they hit a mine, and he got blown up and wrecked his ankles, which were never the same again. Spent the rest of the war in camp because it wasn't worth it to him to send him home. Came back to Marblehead and was a fisherman for the rest of his life. But I had this boat, this English yawl, the great English boat. And we took Jack sailing. I think it had been the first time he sailed since he was a kid. And he said that he and his father was meticulous in the care of his boat and painting it and polishing the bottom. I think they had a Rhodes 19, a wooden Rhodes 19, and they when they sailed, they alternated who had the helm, different races, and they always argued and fought it while they were, but they always won, both because of the preparation of the boat and the fact that they were always working together, even though it sounded like argument or fighting. They were always having more input. You need to have input. Was the thing about sailing with Lee Van Gemmert. We went to his 80th birthday party, and this guy named what's his first name? But Connolly was an old sailor and a sailor with Lee. He said he gave a little talk like everybody did about what a guy Lee was. But he said he sailed a lot of ocean races with Lee, but there was never anybody quicker to be in his berth when he was off watch. And when he came when he came back onto deck, he always had something to say. You know, shouldn't that sheet be just pulled in just a little bit? Don't you need to just trim that sail a little bit? He was always talking. Jackie Burns, we had a great, it was really nice sailing with him. I mean, just having him there looking like he did there in that picture. And saying, I can still do it. I still remember how to sail. Where he'd been running motorboats, lobstering and stuff for years. This is that boat, the English yawl, Albert Strange design.
The artist?
He was the artist. He was mainly a watercolor painter. He did paint some oils. He did etchings and all kinds of things. But he was the director of the Scarborough Art School in Scarborough, England, from 1882 until he died in 1917. But he designed at least 150 boats in that time because he was a sailor. The middleman in this picture is Lee Van Gemmert. It's me with my silly hat. And a man named Bob Campbell. And we're standing at Lee, the Indian that we'd sailed. We won these races. We won a race with the three of us in Manchester, the Crocker Memorial Race. And the next year, Lee entered that boat in the race. And when Lee bought that boat from that man's 5 minutes, backyard. He didn't know anything about it. He said it was number 100. He was walking across the yacht club lawn and he saw Bob Campbell, and he said, I just bought an Indian. And Bob said, which one? He said, I don't know. But it was number 100. And Bob said, that was built for my father in 1949. It's Cheyenne. So that was amazing. This is an Albert Strange design boat that I'm going to go back. This is the boat that I'm sort of working to build now. This was the last boat Albert Strange designed for himself, but was never built. Because it was designed in 1914, just before the war, World War I started. No boats were built during the war, or very few of any recreational sort, and Strange died in 1917, before it was over. And this is Tally Ho. It's a boat that's being restored right now in Port Townsend, Washington, that I'm the honorary secretary of the Albert Strange Association. For some reason, I fell into this role. I keep writing things, but
Does that mean you don't have to do anything? Honorary?
it was explained to me. I once made the mistake of saying honorable, and I did. And the man that I did that to, he said, no, it's honorary, and what honorary means is you're not paid. But this boat won the Fastnet race, a big race off of England in 1927, the third Fastnet race, and it ended up being a fishing boat out of Brookings, Oregon. And as the honorary secretary of the Albert Strange Association, the Albert Strange Association ended up owning the boat because people wanted to cut it up. And it ended up, just before it got cut up, a young Englishman showed up with the interest in it, and we saved it, and he's been rebuilding it for the last 6 years now. And it's if you look up Tally Ho or Sampson Boat Company in the computer, you'll see the work he's done on it is just wonderful. It's getting there now. But anyway, I think that's the end of this. Phil says I'm done.
Is that the boat with the purple artwork down there?
Yes.